He is worth more than $2 billion. He sits on the board of Netflix. He once helped buy 400 million vaccine doses for an entire continent. And it all began when a young engineer did something almost no one in Africa had ever dared to do. He sued his own government, and he won. His name is Strive Masiyiwa. This is the story of how he broke a dictator's monopoly, built a technology empire across Africa, and became Britain's first black billionaire by refusing, for 5 years, to give up. To understand the fight, you first have to understand the man. Strive Masiyiwa was born in 1961 in what was then Rhodesia, white ruled, and on the edge of a long war for black majority rule. When he was 7, his family left for Zambia. By the age of 12, he was at boarding school in Scotland. He grew up between three countries and two worlds. In 1978, as a teenager, he came home wanting to join the guerrilla fighters battling for independence, but an officer turned him away with a piece of advice that would shape his entire life. The war is almost won, he was told. What this country will need next is people who can build it. So go and learn. So he did. He studied electrical engineering in Wales. And in 1984, 4 years after Zimbabwe became independent, he came home again, this time to help wire a new nation. He joined the state telecoms company and rose to become a principal engineer. It was a good job, a safe job, and he walked away from it. He was tired of the bureaucracy, tired of watching a slow, state-run monopoly fail to connect ordinary people. So in 1988, he quit and started his own business. And then, in the early 1990s, he saw the future coming, the mobile phone, and he decided that Zimbabwe would not be left behind. In 1993, he founded a company called Econet Wireless and applied for a license to build the country's first mobile network. The government said no, because in Zimbabwe, telecommunications belonged to the state, to a monopoly called the PTC, and the state was not interested in competition. Behind that monopoly stood the government of Robert Mugabe. For almost anyone, that would have been the end, a rejected license from a government you do not argue with. But Masiyiwa did something extraordinary. He took the government to court, and his argument was not really about phones, it was about freedom. His lawyers argued that a state monopoly on communication violated the Constitution of Zimbabwe, the right to freedom of expression, the right of every citizen to receive and to share information without the state standing in the way. A phone network, he argued, was a form of speech, and no government had the right to own all of it. What followed was a 5-year war of attrition. He was in and out of the High Court and the Supreme Court. The government threw up obstacle after obstacle. His money ran out. He came to the very brink of bankruptcy. People laughed at him, the young man taking on the state and losing everything to do it. Then, in 1995, the Supreme Court of Zimbabwe handed down a landmark ruling. The state monopoly on telecommunications, it said, was unconstitutional. It was a stunning victory, and the government's response was to try to erase it. Mugabe issued a presidential decree to keep private operators out. So Masiyiwa went back to court again. And in 1997, after 5 long years, the courts finally forced the government's hand. Econet Wireless was granted its license. In 1998, the network switched on. The monopoly was over. One man, with no political power, had beaten the government of Robert Mugabe in its own courts and changed the law for an entire continent. His case became a landmark, cited across Africa, that helped crack open the telecoms industry to private companies everywhere. But winning came at a cost. By the year 2000, Zimbabwe was sliding into economic collapse, and Masiyiwa's relationship with the government had turned dangerous. Fearing for his safety, he left. He went into exile, first to South Africa and then to London. And from outside the country, he began to build something far bigger than a single network. Econet went pan-African. And today, Strive Masiyiwa controls a sprawling technology group. He owns around 38% of Econet Wireless Zimbabwe, still one of the country's largest companies. He owns roughly a third of EcoCash, the mobile money service that lets millions of Zimbabweans send cash by phone in a country where the banking system had all but collapsed. And he owns more than half of Liquid, the company that has laid tens of thousands of kilometers of fiber optic cable across Africa, from Cape Town to Cairo. That fiber is the backbone. It is the invisible infrastructure that carries the internet across the continent. Data centers, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, his newest company, Cassava Technologies, is building all of it. The engineer who was once denied a single phone license now helps run the digital nervous system of a continent, and the world noticed. In 2020, Netflix appointed him to its board of directors, the first African ever to sit there. He advises Unilever, the National Geographic Society, the Gates Foundation, and the Council on Foreign Relations. When the pandemic struck, the African Union made him its special envoy, the man responsible for finding vaccines for a continent the rest of the world was ignoring. He helped secure 400 million doses for Africa. The boy who had once been turned away from a guerrilla army had become one of the most powerful Africans alive. But ask Strive Masiyiwa what he is most proud of, and he will not talk about the money. In 1996, in the middle of Zimbabwe's HIV and AIDS crisis, as the disease left a whole generation of orphans behind, he and his wife Tsitsi started the Higher Life Foundation. It began as a scholarship fund for orphaned and vulnerable children. Since then, it has paid for close to 500,000 scholarships, 500,000 children given an education they could never otherwise have afforded. He is a devoted Christian who gives away a large share of his fortune and who writes almost every day to the millions of young Africans who follow him, telling them over and over the same thing that officer once told him: go and build. There is a version of the African billionaire that the world knows well, the one whose fortune comes from the state, from connections, from wealth quietly taken. Strive Masiyiwa is the other story. A man who got nothing from the state, who had to sue it for 5 years just for the right to compete, whose fortune was not handed to him, but fought for in a courtroom against a dictator. And he is proof of something simple and easy to forget, that the most valuable thing an African entrepreneur can ever be given is not money. It is the freedom to build. If this story shows you a different side of African wealth, subscribe, because the next one is already being written.